Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's BAInsights. And today we're talking about NLP and business analysis. And what does NLP means? Neuro-Linguistic Programming. We're going to hear a little bit more about this really interesting topic in a moment. We've got Maria with us. She's going to introduce herself. But just before we get into that, it will be an interesting conversation, I'm sure. If you haven't liked and subscribed already, please do so. If you've got any comments yourself, you want to share your experience on NLP or similar, please use the comments and do so. It'd be good to hear from you. But before all of that, let's hear from Maria and ask her to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you so much. Obviously, Maria Montgomery. I am your success builder elevation coach, and I have been in business analysis field for over 3 decades now, shows my age. And what intrigued me particularly, this topic is very close to my heart, is through my coaching passion in coaching and business analysis and also career development topics as well. I am currently based in Melbourne, Australia, and I am also consulting as a business analyst or on a implementation as a Salesforce, very big program of work as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maria. All right, so I guess let's dive straight into the first question to set the scene, really. And that has to be really, for those that are not familiar with what NLP is or might be, how would you describe neuro-linguistic programming in simple terms that might apply to business analysts?
So what I as term NLP is it's really a set of techniques that help you explore how people think, communicate, and behave. It's actually all about understanding certain patterns, particularly in their language, thoughts, and behaviors, which help influencing outcomes and also improve communication. So specifically, if we look at the BA and how it can help us in business analysis space, it will help us understand how stakeholders, for example, express requirements, how we uncover those misalignments, particularly with the requirements and what gets delivered. It also helps clarifying some of those complex business needs. For example, noticing stakeholders' words, the words that they choose, or some hesitation might give you a bit of a hint of what that underlying issue is and how we can explore that further.
Quite interesting what you said about I guess, the use of words, because that will really emphasize, I guess, the connection between the words and the emotions that they're using, and therefore potentially the importance or maybe the lack of importance for a particular topic, or how impactful something is as it affects them as well. So I think it's so just by what you were sharing there, Maria, it it definitely feels like it's something we should be thinking about as business analysts, because we deal with people, and I think NLP is obviously closely connected to people and how we communicate, as you mentioned. Um, and I think, yeah, just as you said, I think it helps us sort of explore how people think, how they talk, and how we can connect better. So perhaps we can ask better questions and maybe support more of a meaningful change with those individuals we're working with.
That's exactly right.
I wonder, are there any valuable techniques relating to NLP that you would suggest that are uh, definitely applicable for business analysts?
Yes, definitely. NLP techniques that are really valuable are because they improve, for example, your communication. Another important one that I have discovered through my journey in business analysis is empathy and understanding of stakeholder needs. This can help business analysts particularly be able to ask the right question and potentially find those hidden, uncover those requirements that sometimes stakeholders, for some reason or another, hesitate to tell us or don't know how to tell us, or you unintentionally or even intentionally don't tell us. And where they also can help is managing those difficult stakeholder conversations. For example, I was working on a very fast-paced project in a company called ANZ, which is one of the big banks in Australia, in Melbourne. And I happened to be dealing, because I was working a lot of payments projects, I had to be dealing with accountants, which they couldn't quite describe the complex financial rules. I literally had to look at the business rules on payments and how the payments were getting through from, for example, customer making a payment on a loan to where we ended up in a ledger in a bank. And it was so complex. And one of the great techniques that I found is understanding empathy and being able to document those conversations in a structured manner. For example, I ended up with lots of general ledgers. I happen to be having accounting background, by the way. I did a bachelor degree in accounting, but I found a way how I could meaningfully communicate with the accountants, and I drew pages and pages of general ledgers, which I had to translate into business requirements and business rules. So there you go.
And that takes me back, Maria, to a project I was on quite a few years ago, actually working with finance and having to understand a little bit some of their business rules that ultimately become that balance sheet and P&L postings as well. So it takes me back. I won't start reminiscing much further than that. I'm not sure too many people will be interested in my financial ramblings, but certainly interesting to hear that point. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think having those NLP techniques, and probably many of them people won't necessarily correlate to being NLP, but they probably are. Just helps us really understand the stakeholder needs, as you mentioned, just by, I guess, recognizing the signs that there's more to be said, perhaps, and exploring more than what's just said in the first instance, and helping the stakeholder feel comfortable to explore that level of detail as well. You know, I think probably as well, make sure that allow the BA to feel comfortable as they're exploring like difficult, complex situations. Is probably part of it.
Exactly.
Um, and yeah, I think just helping people maybe as well sort of accept the change or adopt the change, at the later end of the change process. So I think they're all probably useful reasons for adopting some of the NLP, neuro-linguistic programming mentality anyway. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for BAs in their day-to-day work?
I think for me, and for me also personally, particularly in a space of facilitating workshop and eliciting those specific sessions, obviously that's a big part of our um, job that we do, I guess, as business analysts. And when you're facilitating workshops, for example, you will have lots of different personality types and you're trying to group different stakeholders in order to achieve the outcome of, for the project. And quite often, these techniques particularly can help in facilitating and getting that combined communication in a session is important. The other one is an interesting one that I've learned over the years of me learning about NLP is looking at how we refine and write the requirements, how we need to have the precise language. And this goes back to that point around having the empathy, understanding your stakeholder, the personality type. And my example was, I keep on going back to the accountant type, but I had lots of different types, but understanding, well, how do you clearly articulate what is the precise language that you need to use? The other one that is, and I know as business analysts, we all face, we haven't been on one project, but I haven't been faced with resolving conflicts or misunderstanding between stakeholders. We all use agile ways of working. However, I've always had those situations when they start seeing things and not getting things, and you have stakeholders with different views. I feel that using some of the NLP techniques, again, with a bit of empathy, trust, potentially looking at proper techniques in replaying or getting people in a room can be quite helpful. Reading those subtle cues, for example, that might help that communication a bit better. in a way of asking the right questions, or see if there's any ambiguity, anything that they're actually not telling you. I kind of see those as probably the more key ones that could potentially help in that day-to-day business analysis world. And our key outcomes are what we do produce is, workshop working with the stakeholders and also writing requirements.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think, based on what you're saying there around, things like workshops and building trust and using that sort of that right language to empathize and understand your stakeholders is yeah, it's a super key point for me as well. I think that in workshops it can be important, but it can also be important in one-to-one interviews as well. And whatever the medium is that these stakeholder engagements are occurring, as a business analyst, we want to build those relationships with the stakeholders. We want them to trust us. We want them to understand what they are, what they need. We want to really understand them. I think we really need to care about them as well. I think which is part of it. And I think when I think about the caring about the stakeholder and what they're actually asking for, that makes me sort of almost think about NLP in reverse in a way. Because I suspect if you're a business analyst who doesn't really care about the stakeholder, that's probably comes across to your stakeholders as well, in what you're saying and how you're acting. So it's probably important just to recognize that if you don't really believe what you're doing, that's going to have an impact on your stakeholder, on your body language, on your tone as well. So they're quite important points for me to think about as I think about. I think by recognizing NLP as well, seeing the opportunities for for working with different stakeholders in different ways, it definitely makes me think about how we can sort of like make small shifts in our psychology or our language as we work with different stakeholders that have slightly different styles as well. Because I think again your point resonated about having different stakeholders together because it may be the case, of course, that you might have all the stakeholders are all very similar, all very loud, or all very, then the opposite end of the spectrum, not speaking, very quiet, and you still need to extract the information from all of them. Or where there's that mix, understand that you've got to make space for people that have a slightly quieter disposition and someone that's naturally more robust, who's willing to take over a meeting maybe. So they're all things that can help. I think as well, something else that I think it is quite useful for is thinking about how you can manage some of the resistance to change as part of your stakeholder conversations as well. And you can almost sort of like reframe some of the conversations, think about them in a slightly different way to help your stakeholders. So one example I was thinking of just before this really was, trying to take your stakeholder beyond where they are now to where they could be in the future. So for example, you could say to them, imagine it's 6 months after implementation, what's working better for you in that environment? So you can sort of tease out what they would really like to see if conventional style is not really working.
Yeah, I like using, sorry, you open up my passion in this space as well. I quite often like using, and if you had a blank sheet of paper or blue sky, what would you want to see? What would you see your self or your work positioning yourself in 5 years' time? Or yeah, so I actually used that in my recent workshops that I have been running as well. And it's working really effective because quite often what happens, particularly, for example, if you're doing your current state analysis, your stakeholders get so boggled down, oh, you're going to change my tools, that they think about technology. What improves you're going to do technology. They don't think about outside of square and exactly to that point, you're saying, well, if you had a blue sky or clear picture, where would you see yourself, say, in the next 5 years time?
Yeah. And I've heard the term mentioned a few times while I was looking into what NLP was, where in terms of like anchoring, to think about sort of like emotional states. Is that something you could explain to me a little bit more as to what that is and how you use that, please?
Yeah, and that's one of the techniques, particularly when I think about that facilitating workshops and interviews, it's really thinking about linking your positive responses to that desired outcome or how you can influence that productive discussion or their concern. So, for example, when I was reframing concern with the stakeholder, particularly around those general ledgers, I saw that as opportunity for them to improve the reconciliation process, for example, efficiently as well. So I was trying to get them to understand the value and the process change rather than actually being defensive. So by anchoring them through something that is a pain point to them, helping with their efficiencies and almost talking their language, I was able to achieve the outcome that they desire. So it's really just linking that positive response with the outcome that you want to try and achieve.
Yeah, yeah. I must say, it's a sort of interesting aspect of NLP on that. And I think we probably do it, but not like to some extent, many BAs without necessarily having a name for it or thinking about what this truly is. But yeah, I guess just there's different reasons, of course, where you speak to different stakeholders, and they're not all super positive or super happy, or even those that are, you might just get them in the wrong hour of the week or the month, and you need to be that positive person. You need to be able to lift the mood up because you can't be two
Exactly.
negative people in a two-person conversation is only going to go one way probably.
That's
So
exactly right.
maintaining that level of calm, enthusiasm, embracing what the benefits of change will be for the organisation, but importantly the person as well, are all really important things for me, which the business analyst can do and think about. Particularly when it's workshops or interviews that they're hosting as well. Um, so I wonder as well. We sort of talked about body language and tone a little bit, and I wonder, how do how does body language and tone, which both core NLP concepts, how do they play a role in effective business analysis for you, Maria?
So for me particularly, I'm actually, you must sometimes look at my body language because I talk with my hands all the time. But to me, it's more around body language, but also tone. What I feel that you can reveal that unspoken concerns, also confidence, or any of the disagreement, like well, you're quite fine with different stakeholders. So I think as a business analyst, if you notice in those subtle gestures or those vocal cues, it can actually alert you to the questions the stakeholders unverbally expressing themselves that you can deep dive more and more. Could be using your whys or, deeping down to the root cause of the problem. But this you, for example, be able to allow you to probe the deeper requirements, understanding of the real problem that we might, for example, need to solve for, of the real explanation. So when I was working on a particular project and we were talking about the fund transfer, so I spent a lot of time in banking sector too. Quite often those different stakeholders that I had from the business bankers, for example, obviously I had the account because it was payments and risk stakeholders. There quite often was a confusion around what their particular areas do. And then when you're trying to consolidate all your requirements and then explaining why we need certain requirements that potentially have to be in scope, it's easy to kind of pause and understand and guide them through different questions so that I could clarify what they needed to say so that I didn't kind of make errors in my documentation. As well. So, yes, I'll get them to explain, I guess, a little bit more of what they mean, why. I'll use those techniques, listen to understand, than to be understood. And, quite often, you have the body language of that want to know about it, flicker in their eyes or whatever that might be. I kind of deep dive more and more and try to, I guess, get them more on board so that they can be part of the requirements gathering and I can get requirements effectively, particularly with some stakeholders where you find They don't want to change. They don't want a new system for whatever reason. Um, I feel that can be quite powerful.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's interesting, like when, I think what I'm about to explain, we probably know this, but we forget about it. When you sort of communicating, it's very easy to think about the words that are being said and only focus on that. In particular, as well, when we spend a lot of time on, virtual meetings, Teams meetings, Zoom meetings, as an example. So you can sort of fall into the trap of just thinking about the words alone. Um, when actually, when it comes to communication, I think I don't know exact numbers, but I feel like the word is a very low percentage of the communication itself, with tone being a more important proportion of really the way we take data in, and then of course the body language as well. So combining those three things, particularly if they're all in tune, if you've got someone that is saying they've got a problem that's urgent, their tone stresses the urgency and the importance of the problem. The body language shows it's definitely important to them and it's definitely something we need to fix. That's really going to hit home the message that you need to do something about this problem for the stakeholder. Whereas the opposite, if you've got like this disparity between behaviors and words, not necessarily to mean that is a problem, but it's something you might need to be aware of and explore further. So as you were talking a moment ago, talking about what you said about body language, I naturally thought about the fact I sometimes sit there with my arms crossed, and that doesn't mean I'm being
Mm,
super defensive
mm.
and I'm not interested. It means actually I'm just really comfortable and I'm quite happy to listen to you, and but if my words and my tone were also suggesting, hey, this person's being defensive, they're not really listening, then there will be a different reason to interpret the crossed arms in a different way.
That's exactly right. Or, if you're having I have seen stakeholders roll their eyes. They really just did not want to be part of the project as well. So it just shows you, for me, it was more their body language and going, okay, how do I need to work with that stakeholder? And it was an important stakeholder in the end, by the way. But
Yeah,
for me, it was more, well, what is the key message or pain point that I need, how I need to work with that person?
yeah. I think, yeah, I think I'm just wondering if there's anything further I can say. I feel like I'm probably going to. Yeah, actually, well, one other thing I think is quite important to think about as well, because we've been talking a lot about sort of like listening to stakeholders and how you get their needs and how you understand them. I think there's also an element as well sometimes of actually we need to convince certain stakeholders and we need to facilitate sessions where we're sort of like we're selling an idea. What I don't mean is I definitely don't mean we're sort of selling the idea of a requirement we've made up as a BA, selling it to the person as their requirement. That's definitely not what I mean. Instead, though, we often speak to maybe people in the team, different teams, and the combination of those views that they've shared with you is a perspective that there is a certain problem that is of certain importance and it needs to be resolved. That isn't always the understanding of maybe the people at the other end of the organization. So you've got to learn to be convincing and to convince those individuals that were not maybe not really close to the detail, that what you're sharing really is important because you've got the data and you've got the facts and the conversations to back it up. And again, I think therefore, knowing how your body language and your tone um, might influence those individuals to really buy into what you're saying, or question it and not believe it and question the credibility. I think that's an important dynamic as well.
I totally agree, especially, that question credibility, particularly, and you might have found this personally yourself as well, moving in different areas, could be finance sector. I spend a lot of time in insurance sector as well, and you'll get those stakeholders that I don't want to give you time in a day because they just expect you to understand what they do, so they don't want to um, have to explain things over and over again. They don't like to be asked questions. So, and I remember those stakeholders too, where it's like, give me a BA that is like, like a SME that understands. I'm like, well, that's not our role. But yeah, so it was kind of understanding him in those situations. Well, having that under your belt, and I must admit, there's been situations, but I wasn't expert, but I learned stuff before I asked questions, or I learned how to work with the stakeholder, jotting all the information down, understanding when I should and shouldn't ask the questions, and what I could learn myself without asking the question, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they used to get really frustrated. If I have to explain it to you again, I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, that's another, I guess, important dynamic that we come across that, a stakeholder might have spent a lot of time explaining the concept to their team, many other stakeholders, or even past BAs. And then you come along, you weren't in that team before, you maybe just joined the organizational team, you don't have all the domain background. So you need to understand it. You definitely need to understand it firsthand. But I guess recognizing their frustrations and try and turn the conversation into a more positive engagement is probably helpful. And I imagine in that situation, actually, there's probably something else we can do as well as sort of use some of those techniques to really engage and listen to what the stakeholders say. Extending beyond that, once we've finished the session, we've action that we think we need to document it and share it back with the stakeholders. So firstly, they know we've got it, or even if we haven't, they know we care enough to get it right. But then the fact it's documented accurately might reassure them that if you need to move on and someone else comes along, the information's there, so they don't have to recite it again. It's actually well written and it articulates what they actually mean and need as well.
Exactly.
I wonder, and we spoke about a number of positive reasons to consider the application of neuro-linguistic programming, Maria. But what's the biggest advantage, if there is such a thing as a single big advantage for you, if we've not mentioned it?
Well, from me and using NLP a lot in the work that I do, the biggest advantage I see is where we can improve clarity and understand that have the stakeholder alignment. So NLP helps me particularly uncover those hidden assumptions, particularly, we talked about body languages and understanding um, not only what the stakeholders might be hiding from us, but also how to kind of uncover what they're not telling us so that we got enough detail to complete our requirements. But it's also aligning expectations and also making complex information being understandable, particularly for everyone. So this is where, I've used a lot of my techniques, particularly with stakeholder and language understanding, understanding how I could save time, particularly instead of me going backwards, having errors and having gaps in my requirements. So for me, definitely it's around clarity and stakeholder alignment if I was going to pick the top advantage.
Excellent. And yes, I think mean, I think that's an excellent one. Probably one I would definitely agree with. Probably my biggest advantage. I think I would call that probably the same. However, because that's the case, I think I'll maybe pick one that's a little bit further down my list. I'm not sure where it's number two, but yeah, I think it pretty just goes back to what we said a little while ago in terms of reduced conflict and like smoother workshops, smoother interviews, just helping you not just recognize the tone and body language of stakeholders, but probably when it changes as well, because sometimes that body language and tone can change in reaction to something that someone else in the room said, and being attuned to that, picking that up, and sort of knowing how to behave with it and asking the right questions to follow on from it are all important skills for a business analyst. And I think probably an example that comes to mind is those situations where the conflict or what's said is to such a degree that it's almost like a drop the mic moment, and no one wants to talk after that. Which isn't helpful if you've got plenty more things you want to explore. So having a way to sort of build the energy up in the room, reconnect with the stakeholders, get beyond that little point of contract, or it's a little piece, that piece of conflict is probably helpful. But also probably identify before that verbal conflict has occurred. You can probably get to tell that if there's certain stakeholders who are like their hackles are up and they're not sort of they're not in agreement with what else is being said, and it's very obvious. It gives you the opportunity to notice it and then manage it. You know, maybe sort of like bring in the other individual into the conversation rather than it being them shouting and to interject their disagreement. So I think that's probably a huge advantage for me. Just being able to be a bit proactive in the way you deal with situations, workshops, and stakeholders. Maria, how was learning for NLP and some of the approaches? How has it helped you change the way that your approach to business analysis or dealing with stakeholder conversations?
Yeah, where it helped me specifically was me becoming more observant and intentional. So learn not to just listen to the words, but also the tone, the way the stakeholders are communicating with me, if they're pacing, their body language, as well. So it's kind of, their whole persona, particularly whether it's in workshop and in meetings. What it has taught me to do is adapt my approach for each stakeholder, for example, as well. So having, understanding different types of stakeholders, how I would approach them as well. And this has led me to more clear communication, more faster resolution of those misunderstandings. Just what you were mentioning before, particularly as you get into two different stakeholders to make sure that they get onto the same page. It kind of assists you really to get to the bottom of that misunderstanding. And when I worked on some of my projects and looking at that aspect of general ledger that I've used previously, after learning NLP, what it made me do is really paid attention on how stakeholders were expressing their uncertainty. So this made me actually ask more better questions, provide explanation that match their understanding. I've learned reconciliation words and things that will get them to understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing what I'm doing as well. And I could talk their language so I can get the information that I need. So for me, the key was really that I became observant and I stopped and I listened more. So I listened to understand and I observed their body language as well.
It's interesting, Maria. I think like a lot of what we've been talking about, I feel like some people might bucket that some of it at least under active listening, and maybe it is, right? But also, I think there's more to it than just active listening, as we've been talking about. So I think probably there might be people watching this and listening, thinking, what's the difference? I'm not sure there's a huge difference, but I feel like it feels like active listening has some of the concepts that we talk about from the neuro-linguistic perspective, but then NLP is just going a step beyond. I feel like whether that's proven, I'm not sure, but that's my view on that. I think as well. I think just to share, what I've sort of, I guess my approach is sort of in relation to this. I'm going to just touch on a couple of matters. I think for me, like, yes, it's definitely important to learn about how to interact with stakeholders and how to read them and how to sort of mirror them in certain cases or not in other situations. But I think being authentic really matters. I think as a business analyst, trying to like read all of I guess the every bit of the NLP sort of handbook if there is such a thing, and straight out the blocks trying to adopt a style and the approaches when it's not natural to you and it's sort of being a little bit unauthentic is not the right approach for business analysts. I think they need to be authentic. They need to find a way to adopt many of these fairly straightforward approaches while being themselves. I think that probably leads on to having a little bit of self-awareness as well, for the business analyst, to make sure that they're aware when somebody approaches the techniques, whatever they call them, whether they're working, because there may be times where our own style and our own approach might be at the heart of why some of the stakeholders feel a little bit defensive, or they feel there's a conflict. It could be our style. So being aware of that and being able to change our style or change our tone or our approach is helpful. And I think sometimes, well, I think cultural sensitivity might also be another aspect to think about, because it's probably easy to think about how you might read the body language of your friends who you've sort of spent 20 years with, but if you're suddenly working with stakeholders in a brand new country that you've never worked in before, it's quite possible that their culture and their behaviors are a little different. So maybe what you might have observed as defensive is the opposite, in a different culture. So I guess that having that awareness is probably useful. Leads me on to another question, really, in terms of, because there's loads of techniques, there's loads of concepts we've been talking about in this short time. I'm sure there's many, many more. But if I was a BA and I have to, and I wanted to adopt or apply NLP tomorrow, what's the first thing, Maria, do you think that you'd encourage a business analyst to practice and to learn?
Probably a couple of things. First, that I would recommend is starting with active listening, and also mirroring is another very important concept. And this really relates to paying attention on how stakeholders speak, their body language, and the words. So we mention words a lot in this our conversation. And what is the choice of words? And this will really reflect back to subtly of what they're trying to build. What kind of rapport are you trying to build with them? You will ensure that you understand, what they're trying to get across before diving into their complex requirements. So that could just really help, particularly from the active mirroring. Like, listening, not mirroring. Mirroring and matching, I find that is really useful as you're adapting stakeholders, so that you can watch their tone of voice or language and to try and build a rapport. Could be that movement and how they communicate with you that you're actually mirroring, so that you can be in sync with them when you're having a conversation. So for me, like if I was going to give any tips, would be that particularly active listening, watch the words patterns, repeating or re-paraphrasing, can't say that word, of what they're saying. What I've started to use a lot actually, and I used it today, as a matter of fact, I was running a workshop, and the stakeholder was very passionate about future. And I couldn't quite understand the terminology they use. And I'm dealing with the legal department now, right? So they've got their own sections they're talking about. So I use what I heard you say, and I'll play back what I thought I heard them say, so that they can clarify what my assumption is. And they'll say, well, no, that's not what I meant. Let me explain it to you. So quite often, paraphrasing repeating so you can understand what they're saying is also very useful.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think this is probably quite easily overlooked, I think, as a BA, to almost have the conversation with a stakeholder, make your notes, rely on your notes, go away, and irrespective of how well or not so well it went, sort of you're then, maybe you've missed an opportunity to play back that part of the conversation when all of it was fresh in both your minds. And instead, you might go back several days, several hours later and ask the stakeholder to review a sentence or two that you would have discussed. Whereas in the session itself, you probably have notes anyway. So just use that as an opportunity to play back what you've understood. And I think it will be it'll be easier then for the stakeholder to sort of realign your understanding with what they really meant, as you said. I think I'm gonna talk about something or touch on something very briefly, which you mentioned before, actually, as the first thing that I would ask people to practice, and that's just that heightened observation that you mentioned. I think just paying real attention to how people are communicating with you and between each other. The words they're using, the body language, the tone. Um, you know, there's a number of things that if you watch people who are very good at communicating, or even actually those that are not very good, there's plenty to be learned, I think. Um, I'm thinking of examples where you've got a number of people in a workshop and you're not all in front of each other. You need to sort of move around a little bit to speak to certain people. And I think just finding a way to face that stakeholder without turning your back on everybody else is one very small example of how we can pay attention to how others might communicate, and if we had our back to someone's back turned to us when they're presenting in a session, I don't think we'd feel very good about it. So if we're aware of that, maybe we can mitigate it in our own actions. So, and I think, along those lines, I mean, quite often things that we observe as BAs, not just techniques, but I think approaches and the ways we say things, that if we recognize someone doing it better, I think a lot of us go, actually, that's really good. We're going to try and make that part of our approach in future. So I think observation, if nothing else, will give you that ability to improve your own behaviours. But I'm very confident it'll give you a lot more than that, of course. Brilliant. So I guess, Maria, is there anything else that you might want to share on the topic of NLP and business analysis?
Yes, so I think I'm very passionate in this area, as you can see. I think it has done a lot of, I guess, my growth, particularly in business analysis space. My key three things that I always use and where it really helps me is getting the right outcome from the stakeholders. And we talked a lot about, your observations. We talked about anchoring is probably another one that I would strongly recommend and think about, those linkages and positive responses to desired outcomes. Reframing is really another perspective where I'm finding really helps when you're presenting requirements or problems, and where you want to look at it from a different perspective and to get their buying. So I find reframing is another very logical technique to use. And something you mentioned earlier, as you were talking about, gaining stakeholders' trust, winning that trust and a heart. I actually, when I wrote my book, The Art of Getting Business Analysis Right, and I've got a the art of getting business analysis right model. Within that model, one of the key things that I do talk about is communication. It's kind of aligned to NLP to a degree, and I've got a little heart. It's like following that heart and getting that trust, and using your cognitive theory, if you like, to help you communicate with those stakeholders as well. So that's kind of probably the key advice or that I can share, and I highly recommend looking even small steps, looking those small little tips or areas of NLP that will make your journey business analysis and working with your stakeholder much better.
Perfect. Well, no better place to stop than that, Maria. I think that's probably an amazing place to stop. I really enjoyed the conversation. Hope our viewers have as well. Definitely an interesting topic, and one that I think gets a bit more interesting the more you look into it, and the more, particularly as the sort of penny drops a little bit on that we're probably doing many of these things already, and not necessarily thinking about them. But once we're aware of it, we can use that to get better at some of those things like observation, anchoring, reframing, and all the other excellent things you mentioned as well. But brilliant. Well, thank you, Maria, and thank you everybody for watching.
Thank you.